If confirmed, reports that United States ground troops have crossed into northern Mexico would represent one of the most serious escalations in North American security in modern history, not because of the scale of the forces involved, but because of what a physical border crossing means in geopolitical terms. Borders are not just lines on maps, they are psychological barriers that separate diplomacy from force, and once soldiers cross them, even in limited or disputed circumstances, the entire logic of containment begins to collapse. According to early reports emerging within the last hour, U.S. military units were detected operating south of the U.S.-Mexico border in areas of Sonora and Chihuahua, regions long associated with cartel activity, but also deeply sensitive symbols of Mexican sovereignty. U.S. officials have described ongoing operations as routine counter-narcotics and security missions, while Mexican authorities have stated they are actively verifying a possible unauthorized violation of national territory. And this gap between narratives is precisely where escalation risk is born. Even if the movement was limited, temporary, or misinterpreted, the political consequences are immediate because modern conflicts are no longer defined only by confirmed facts, but by perception, reaction, and momentum. Mexico is not a failed state. It is not a distant battlefield, and it is not a country without institutional power. It is a major nation with a functioning military, a strong sense of national identity, and a long historical memory of U.S. intervention. And any perception that foreign troops have crossed its border triggers not only legal processes, but emotional and political ones that are far harder to control. What matters most in the early hours of such a report is not whether every detail is verified, but how leaders respond before verification is complete, because premature statements harden positions and limit off-ramps. Mexican political culture leaves very little room for ambiguity on territorial sovereignty. Once the idea of a border violation enters public consciousness, the government is forced to respond publicly, even if privately it prefers de-escalation. Silence becomes politically impossible. On the U.S. side, domestic political pressure moves in the opposite direction. Once American leaders frame an operation as necessary for security or counter-narcotics enforcement, walking it back can be portrayed as weakness, especially in an election-driven environment where toughness is rewarded and nuance is punished. This is how limited incidents grow larger than their original scope, not through intent, but through political gravity. Historically, U.S.-Mexico security cooperation has existed in a narrow space where intelligence sharing, training, and joint operations are carefully structured to avoid the appearance of unilateral force. Because both sides understand that optics matter as much as outcomes, a single image of foreign troops on national soil can undo years of quiet cooperation. If these reports are confirmed, they would mark a departure from that model, shifting from partnership to unilateral action. And once that shift occurs, even temporarily, it becomes a reference point that cannot be erased. The border itself amplifies this danger because it is not a distant theater where escalation can be isolated. It is a shared space tied to trade, migration, and daily civilian life. Any disruption sends immediate economic and social shockwaves. Markets react, supply chains hesitate, and populations on both sides begin to interpret routine activity through a lens of fear. Even without active combat, the mobilization of forces on both sides creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Defensive postures are read as offensive. Preparation. Surveillance is interpreted as targeting, and restraint is seen as vulnerability. International actors are already watching closely because a destabilized U.S.-Mexico relationship affects far more than two countries. It touches North American trade architecture, global supply routes, and the credibility of borders as stabilizing mechanisms in a world already under strain. What makes this moment particularly volatile is timing, coming after weeks of escalating rhetoric, deadline-driven ultimatums, and public pressure campaigns. The margin for misunderstanding is thinner than usual. Leaders are primed for confrontation, not compromise. If confirmed, even a limited crossing would force Mexico to choose between protest and response. And in geopolitics, responses rarely remain symbolic for long. The danger is not that either side seeks war, but that neither side can afford to appear passive once a line is perceived to have been crossed. And that is how conflicts begin, not with declarations, but with reactions to events that move faster than diplomacy can keep up with. The reason analysts treat any potential ground movement across the U.S.-Mexico border as uniquely dangerous is that North America has, until now, been insulated from the type of interstate military escalation that has become common elsewhere. The stability of the continent rests on an assumption that borders are inviolable except by mutual consent. And once that assumption is questioned, the strategic calculus changes everywhere. If confirmed, such an action would immediately raise questions not just about intent, but precedent. Because once a state demonstrates willingness to cross a border for security reasons, even narrowly defined ones, it establishes a logic that others can later invoke, and geopolitics is built on reciprocity. What one power justifies today becomes justification for another tomorrow. For Mexico, the issue would quickly shift from the specifics of the incident to the broader principle of sovereignty. No government in Mexico can afford to appear tolerant of foreign troops operating unilaterally on its soil, especially given historical narratives that frame past interventions as humiliations that must never be repeated. Public pressure would push leaders toward visible resistance. Diplomatic protest alone may not be sufficient to satisfy domestic expectations, and once military forces are placed on alert, the risk of accidental confrontation rises exponentially. For the United States, the dilemma would be equally complex. Backing down under pressure risks signaling limits to enforcement, while escalation risks international condemnation and regional destabilization. Neither option is clean, and both carry long-term consequences. This is why border conflicts are so dangerous. They compress decision-making timelines, reduce room for quiet negotiation, and force leaders to act under intense public scrutiny. The involvement of international institutions would likely follow quickly: emergency meetings, statements calling for restraint, and offers of mediation. But such mechanisms often lag behind events on the ground, and by the time they activate, positions may already be hardened. Economically, the consequences would begin almost immediately. Currency volatility, trade uncertainty, and risk repricing would hit markets that depend on seamless cross-border movement. Companies do not wait for confirmation when uncertainty rises. They adjust first and ask questions later. Strategically, other powers would be watching closely, not because they are directly involved, but because how North America handles internal escalation sets examples. If the most economically integrated region in the world cannot manage border stability, it weakens arguments for restraint elsewhere. The most dangerous aspect of this scenario is that de-escalation requires both sides to accept ambiguity. And ambiguity is politically toxic in moments framed as crises. Leaders are pushed to provide clarity, certainty, and strength, even when clarity does not exist. If these reports are later disproven or clarified, the damage may still linger. Trust once shaken is difficult to fully restore, especially when military movements are involved. History shows that many conflicts are remembered not for their causes, but for their first irreversible step, the moment after which returning to the previous status quo becomes impossible. That is why analysts focus less on intent and more on process, how decisions are made, how information is framed, and how quickly leaders lock themselves into positions. If confirmed, a U.S. ground presence in northern Mexico would force a redefinition of regional security norms, not because of its scale, but because of its symbolism. It would suggest that pressure campaigns have moved beyond rhetoric into physical enforcement, and once that threshold is crossed, even temporarily, future crises will be interpreted through that lens. The coming hours matter more than the coming weeks, because early framing shapes long-term narratives. If leaders choose restraint, ambiguity can still be managed, but if they choose confrontation, even symbolic, the spiral accelerates. This is how wars start now, not with declarations or mass mobilization, but with contested movements, competing statements, and political systems that reward escalation faster than they reward patience. And whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point depends less on what happened on the ground and more on how both sides choose to interpret and respond to it before momentum takes control.